The evening air carried the smell of rain-soaked asphalt as people hurried past the small grocery store on the corner of Maple and 7th. Inside, under the harsh white lights, shelves leaned heavy with packaged foods, boxes stacked neatly, jars gleaming, bread loaves lined like soldiers on parade. For most shoppers, these shelves were nothing more than background scenery, an endless cycle of buying and restocking. But for a 15-year-old boy named Daniel, the bread aisle was more than just rows of food. It was survival. Daniel's stomach twisted as he stood near the end of the aisle, eyes darting between the loaf of bread and the pack of cheese he had been staring at for almost 10 minutes. He pressed his hands deep into the pockets of his worn hoodie, feeling nothing but lint. Not a single coin rattled. His sneakers were scuffed, and his jeans had frayed at the knees. He had tried asking for help that morning, at the bus stop, outside the diner, near the church steps. People had either turned their faces away or muttered an apology without slowing down. "Please, just something to eat," he had whispered more times than he could count. But hunger didn't answer prayers, and strangers rarely answered pleas. Now, as he looked at the bread and cheese, he thought of his mother. She had been lying on the couch when he left earlier, her face pale, breathing shallow. Once, she had been strong enough to work double shifts at the laundry, carrying home the scent of detergent and steam. But illness had stripped that strength away. Now even getting up to drink water looked like a battle for her. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, his heart pounding. He didn't want to steal. He had never imagined himself the kind of kid who would. But the growl in his stomach was matched by the thought of his mother's dry lips, the way she whispered, "Don't worry, sweetheart," even when he could see she was in pain. That whisper hurt worse than any hunger. He swallowed hard, glanced around, and when no one was looking, slipped the loaf of bread under his hoodie, tucking it against his chest. The cheese pack followed a second later, cold against his skin. His heart hammered as he stepped toward the exit. Just a few more feet, just the sliding doors, and he would be free. But a hand grabbed his arm before he could make it through. The grip was firm, rough. A security guard with a square jaw and suspicion in his eyes. "What's under the hoodie, kid?" the guard demanded. Daniel froze, words tangled in his throat. He tried to pull away, panic flaring, but the guard's grip tightened. The struggle tipped over a nearby shelf, boxes tumbling noisily to the floor. Shoppers turned to stare. The bread and cheese slipped from Daniel's hoodie and landed at his feet. And in that moment, with the store lights glaring down and the guard's fingers digging into his arm, Daniel felt something worse than fear, shame. The fallen bread rolled a few inches before stopping against a shopper's shoe. The cheese pack lay flat on the shiny floor tiles, a silent witness to Daniel's desperation. A murmur spread through the crowd that had gathered, some eyes filled with pity, others sharp with judgment. The security guard pulled Daniel closer, his grip unyielding. "Thought you'd get away with it, huh?" he said, his voice echoing louder than necessary. It wasn't just about catching a shoplifter. It was about showing authority, about making sure everyone else in the store knew what happened to thieves. Daniel's lips parted, his words clumsy. I didn't mean. The guard barked, cutting him off. "Kid, you stuffed food under your clothes." That's stealing in every language. The boy tried to twist free, the urge to run overwhelming. But the more he resisted, the harder the guard yanked his arm. His breath came fast like a cornered animal. In his struggle, he knocked over another shelf, this one stacked with cans of soup. They clattered and rolled across the floor, the sound deafening in the tense silence. "Stop resisting," the guard snapped. Daniel's chest heaved, his face flushed hot, then drained pale. All he could think about was his mother waiting at home, her voice in his memory asking, "Did you eat, sweetheart?" How could he tell her that not only did he fail, but now he was being dragged away like a criminal? A manager approached, his suit too sharp for the dingy little store. "Call the police," he ordered, his eyes never leaving Daniel. "We'll press charges. Let's make an example of him." The words stung more than the guard's grip. An example. Not a child, not a son, not a boy desperate to keep his mother alive. Just an example. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived, their radios crackling as they stepped inside. One officer was older, his face weathered by years of night shifts and broken neighborhoods. The other was younger, still carrying the stiff posture of academy training. The guard shoved Daniel toward them, caught him red-handed. Bread and cheese, knocked over a couple shelves too. The younger officer pulled Daniel's hands behind his back with practiced ease, the cold bite of metal cuffs locking around his wrists. "Please," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. "It was just food. For my mom." The older officer hesitated for a second, studying the boy's hollow cheeks and trembling frame. His eyes softened, but he said nothing. Rules were rules, and the law didn't bend for empty stomachs. As the officers led him outside, The rain had started again, a steady drizzle soaking his hair and hoodie. Passers-by glanced at him, some shaking their heads, others not caring at all. To them, he was just another kid who made the wrong choice. But to Daniel, every drop of rain felt like a reminder. He had failed his mother. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a mix of history and judgment. The benches creaked as people shifted, whispering about the boy brought in under police escort. Daniel shuffled forward, his wrists still bound in cold steel, until the bailiff unlocked them. He rubbed the red marks on his skin, keeping his head down. It wasn't the first time this court had seen a thief, but it was the first time in a while that a thief looked more like a hungry child than a hardened criminal. His shoulders slumped under the weight of more than just shame. He carried his mother's illness, the emptiness of their refrigerator, and the rejection of every stranger he had begged for help. The judge entered, a tall man with silver hair and glasses that perched low on his nose. His black robe trailed behind him as he took his seat. A gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. Court is now in session. The charges were read aloud by the clerk. Petty theft, attempted escape, property damage, words that sounded harsher than the truth. Each syllable felt like a hammer striking Daniel's chest. When asked for his plea, Daniel swallowed hard. His voice trembled, but he didn't lie. I took the bread and the cheese. The judge tilted his head, studying the boy. Why? His tone wasn't harsh. It was curious, almost gentle. Daniel shifted on his feet. I needed them. Needed them? The judge leaned forward. Why not pay for them? Daniel's eyes stung. He looked at his worn sneakers. I didn't have money. The courtroom grew still. The prosecutor, a man in a press suit, folded his arms, already prepared to argue the law. But the judge continued the questioning himself. You live with your parents? My mom, Daniel said. She's sick, can't work. And your father? Daniel's throat tightened. He left, years ago. The judge's gaze didn't waver. Do you work? I used to, Daniel answered, at a car wash. But when I stayed home one day to take care of my mom, they fired me. Murmurs spread across the benches, the sound of sympathy tangled with disbelief. The judge pressed on. Did you ask anyone for help? Yes, Daniel whispered. Since morning, nobody listened. Silence followed. The boy's voice cracked, and he blinked back tears. I wasn't stealing for me. It was for her. She hasn't eaten properly in days. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The courtroom watched him, waiting for the weight of the law to fall. The prosecutor cleared his throat, ready to insist on punishment. The store manager sat in the back row, arms crossed, his jaw set in stone. But the judge's eyes didn't leave Daniel. He didn't see a criminal. Standing before him, he saw a child, pushed into a corner by hunger, by a system too blind to notice. And in that heavy silence, everyone sensed this trial was not going to unfold in the usual way. The prosecutor rose from his seat, smoothing his tie. Your Honor, the facts are clear. Theft is theft, regardless of motive. The defendant resisted security, damaged property, and endangered others in the store. We recommend the court treat this matter with seriousness. A crime, no matter how small, must not go unpunished. His words were polished, practiced. To him, Daniel was just a case file, a name on the docket. But the judge lifted his hand gently, signaling him to stop. He turned his attention back to Daniel. The boy stood motionless, staring at the floor, waiting for the hammer to fall. Son, the judge said slowly, you admit you stole? Daniel nodded, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, sir. And you stole bread and cheese because you were hungry? Because your mother is ill and you had no other choice? Yes. The judge exhaled, taking off his glasses. For a moment he rubbed his temples, as though the weight of the entire courtroom pressed down on him. Then he straightened and spoke, his voice firm yet carrying an edge of sorrow. Theft is indeed a crime, he began. But today this courtroom must face a harder truth. When a child is forced to steal food to keep his mother alive, the crime is not his alone. It belongs to all of us, to a community that turned its back, to a system that failed to notice, to neighbors who walked by when he begged for help. The room fell silent. Even the prosecutor shifted uneasily in his chair. The judge's words grew stronger. If we punish this boy alone, we declare ourselves innocent, but we are not. I include myself. We are all guilty of allowing hunger to drive him here. Therefore, I place a fine, $10, on every adult present in this courtroom, myself included. None may leave until it is paid. Gasps rippled across the benches. The bailiff's pen paused mid-note. Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. The judge reached into his own pocket, pulling out a crisp bill. He laid it gently on the bench before him. Here is my 10. He turned his gaze toward the back of the room, where the store manager sat stiff and uncomfortable. As for the store, the judge continued, I impose a fine of $1,000, not for the loss of bread or cheese, but for treating a starving child with cruelty, for calling the police when compassion would have cost nothing. Failure to pay within 24 hours will result in an order to close the store. The words struck like thunder. The manager's face flushed red, his mouth opening but no protest escaping. The judge's final words carried the weight of both law and humanity. The fines collected shall be given to the boy with this court's apology. Today we ask his forgiveness, for we, not he, are the true offenders. Daniel's throat tightened. His vision blurred with tears. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. Not as a thief, but as a son. For a long, breathless moment, the courtroom stayed utterly still. The judge's gavel rested on the desk, but it didn't need to strike. His words alone had carried more force than any blow of wood on wood ever could. The silence was broken by the rustle of pockets, the soft clink of coins, and the tearing of bills being pulled from wallets. One by one, people in the room stood and placed money into the bailiff's collection box. Some gave $10, others gave more. A woman in the second row pressed a 20 into the bailiff's hand, her eyes wet. A man who had shaken his head earlier now quietly slipped in a 50, ashamed of his first reaction. Daniel stood frozen. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. The same strangers who would not even look at him that morning when he begged for help were now willingly offering money. He swallowed hard, his lips trembling, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The prosecutor, who had moments ago spoken so firmly of punishment, stared at his own hands before pulling out a crumpled 10 and adding it to the pile. His cheeks flushed. The store manager, however, remained stiff in his seat, his jaw locked. He shifted uncomfortably under the judge's watchful eyes, knowing he had no choice but to obey the ruling. When the bailiff returned, the stack of money was thick, far more than the fines required. The judge looked at it and then at Daniel. This is yours, he said. Not charity, not pity. This is a debt being repaid, a community apologizing to the child it failed. The words broke whatever fragile wall Daniel had tried to build inside himself. His tears came hot and fast, and he covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking. The room blurred around him, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the muffled sound of people sniffing, some quietly weeping with him. The judge's expression softened. Son, you owe no debt here today. You walk out of this courtroom free. Take care of your mother. And remember, this world is not as cold as it sometimes feels. Daniel lifted his head slowly, his eyes red but wide. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, hope flickered in his chest. He wanted to speak, to thank the judge, to thank the strangers, but the words stuck in his throat. All he managed was a choked whisper. Thank you. Around him, the crowd began to clap softly. It wasn't the applause of victory or entertainment. It was the quiet, aching applause of people moved, of hearts stirred awake. The sound grew until the entire courtroom echoed with it. And Daniel, standing small in the center of it all, no longer felt like a thief. He felt like a human being again. The walk back to his neighborhood felt different this time. Daniel carried a paper envelope in his hands, heavy with bills and coins. But it wasn't the weight of money that slowed his steps. It was the weight of disbelief. Each block he passed, each streetlight he walked under, it still felt like the courtroom had been a dream. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and clean. Puddles shimmered under the faint glow of the street lamps. Daniel looked at his reflection in the water. The same scrawny boy with tired eyes stared back. But something had changed. There was light in those eyes now, faint but real. By the time he reached the small apartment building, his heart was pounding again, not from fear this time, but from urgency. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, nearly tripping as he reached the door. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the flicker of an old lamp. His mother lay on the couch, a blanket pulled up to her chin. Her face was thin, her skin pale, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Danny," she whispered, her voice weak but full of relief. "You're back." He rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. "Mom, I'm sorry. His throat tightened. He couldn't bring himself to say I stole. Instead, he took her hand and pressed it between his. "It's okay now. We have food. We'll be okay." From the grocery bag he had grabbed on his way back, he pulled out fresh bread, cheese, and even a carton of milk. His mother's eyes widened, tears spilling down her cheeks. She reached out, touching the loaf of bread as though it was something sacred. "Where did you get all this?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated. He wanted to protect her from the shame, from the truth of handcuffs and courtrooms. But he also wanted her to know that kindness still existed. So he told her, not everything, but enough. I tried to take some food, he admitted, his voice breaking. They caught me. But the judge, he didn't punish me. He said it wasn't just my fault. He made everyone help. He even fined the store. Mom, they gave me money. Enough for us, for now. His mother's hand trembled as she cupped his cheek. Oh, my sweet boy. Her tears slipped into her smile, fragile but proud. You should never have had to do that. I'm so sorry. Daniel shook his head fiercely. No, Mom, don't be sorry. It's not your fault. We'll get through this, I promise. He sat with her, breaking the bread into slices, melting cheese between them, warming it on their little stove. The smell filled the apartment, simple and comforting. When his mother took her first bite, she closed her eyes, and for a moment she looked peaceful, like the world outside their door didn't exist. And as Daniel watched her eat, he realized the judge hadn't just given him money. He had given him something far more valuable, hope that tomorrow could be different. By morning, the case had already begun to ripple through the town, like waves from a stone tossed into still water. A reporter who had been covering another trial happened to be in the courtroom the day before. She wrote an article late into the night, her headline bold across the paper. Judge turns courtroom into lesson on compassion. Copies of the paper hit doorsteps before sunrise. By breakfast, the story had begun to spread across coffee shops, diners and bus stops. Strangers who had never once thought about hunger in their own city now found themselves whispering about the boy who had stolen bread and cheese, not out of greed but desperation. At the small grocery store where it all began, customers eyed the manager with disapproval. Some avoided the store altogether. Others confronted him directly. A child was starving, one woman snapped at the counter. And you called the cops instead of giving him food. Shame on you, the manager muttered excuses about policy and loss prevention, but his voice carried no conviction. He knew the fine would arrive soon. He also knew that his reputation had already cost him more than money ever could. Meanwhile, Daniel and his mother stayed inside their apartment, unaware of how quickly the world outside was changing. He had bought groceries with part of the money and saved the rest, carefully tucking the envelope into a drawer. His plan was simple: stretch it for as long as possible. Buy medicine for his mom, maybe pay part of the rent that was already overdue. But the knock on their door that afternoon was the first sign that their story had grown larger than the walls of their tiny home. When Daniel opened it, he found an elderly woman holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. She smiled nervously. I read about you in the paper, dear. I thought maybe you and your mom could use a warm meal. Daniel blinked, unsure how to respond. He looked back at his mother, who slowly sat up on the couch, her hand covering her mouth in surprise. Thank you, Daniel whispered, taking the dish carefully. More knocks followed. A man from the church brought groceries. A neighbor they barely knew dropped off fresh fruit. Even the landlord, usually gruff and impatient, stopped by, not with an eviction notice, but with an envelope containing a note that read, "Rent covered for the next month. Don't worry." Each act of kindness left Daniel overwhelmed. For so long, it felt like the world had ignored him, treated him as invisible. Now, suddenly, eyes were turning toward him, not with suspicion but with care. That night, as he lay awake, listening to his mother's steady breathing, Daniel thought about the judge's words. The crime is ours, not his alone. Maybe people had finally begun to understand. And maybe, just maybe, change could begin with a single loaf of breath. The following week unfolded like a story Daniel could hardly believe belonged to him. Where once he had walked the streets with his hood pulled low, avoiding eye contact, now people recognized him. Some offered quiet smiles. Others gave him encouraging words. "Keep your chin up, son," one man said outside the corner store. "You're brave," whispered a woman at the bus stop. Daniel didn't feel brave. He felt small, embarrassed even, but their kindness made his chest feel less hollow. One morning, a letter arrived in their mailbox. It bore the seal of the local community center. Inside, neatly typed, was an invitation. "We would like to offer you a part-time position at our center. Flexible hours, light work, and fair pay. You've shown responsibility and resilience, and we believe you deserve a chance." Daniel read it 3 times before showing his mother. Her thin hands shook as she held the paper. "Danny," she whispered, her eyes shining. This is hope." He hugged her tightly, afraid she might break in his arms, but grateful she could still smile. At the center, the job was simple: stacking chairs, cleaning floors, helping younger kids with homework. But to Daniel, it was more than work. It was dignity. It was proof that he wasn't just the boy who had stolen bread. He was someone capable of giving back. The staff treated him kindly, not with pity but with trust. One afternoon, as he swept the gym floor, a counselor said, "You know, Daniel, your story is making people think. Maybe this is the start of something bigger." Daniel looked down at the broom in his hands, unsure how to answer. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted his mum to get better, to have food on the table without fear. Meanwhile, his mother's health slowly began to improve. The medicine they could now afford gave her strength, enough to sit up longer, enough to eat without grimacing. She would sit by the window, watching children play outside, and sometimes she even hummed softly, an old tune Daniel hadn't heard in years. The judge's decision had done more than free Daniel. It had ignited conversations across the city. Churches organized food drives. Local businesses began programs to support struggling families. News stations ran features about poverty in hidden corners of the community. Daniel watched all this with a mix of awe and unease. He never asked to be at the center of change. Yet as he tucked his mother into bed one night, he realized something. Maybe his desperate act had forced people to open their eyes. Maybe, by accident, he had given hunger a face they could no longer ignore. And though the memory of cold handcuffs still lingered, Daniel now held on to something stronger. Not fear, not shame, but possibility. A month later, the community center organized an event called Voices of Compassion. It was meant to highlight people working to fight hunger and homelessness. Flyers went up all over town. Daniel had been helping set up chairs when he saw a name on the guest list that stopped him cold. Judge Harrison. The judge was coming. On the night of the event, the center buzzed with people. There were tables lined with food donations, pamphlets about volunteer programs, and a small stage with a microphone. Daniel tried to stay busy at the back, but when the judge entered the room, their eyes met. Judge Harrison didn't look like a distant authority figure anymore. Out of his robe, wearing a simple grey suit, he seemed almost approachable. He crossed the room, shaking hands, then stopped in front of Daniel. "You must be Daniel," the judge said, his voice low but warm. "Yes, sir." Daniel shifted nervously, but then he added, "Thank you. For what you did, I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." The judge raised a hand gently. "You don't owe me thanks. That day in court wasn't about me saving you. It was about all of us facing ourselves. You reminded us of something we should never have forgotten." Daniel blinked. "I didn't mean to remind anyone. I was just hungry." "And yet," the judge said softly, "your story opened hearts. Sometimes change begins where desperation and courage meet." They talked for a few more minutes, and when the judge moved on to speak to others, Daniel stood a little taller. For the first time, he felt not just like a boy who had been saved, but like someone who mattered in shaping what came next. By winter, Daniel's life looked nothing like it had just months before. The envelope of money had helped his mother stabilize. The community center job had grown into something more permanent. He was now a junior coordinator, helping design programs for other kids in need. He found himself speaking to small groups about his experience. Not to glorify it, but to show that hunger can live quietly next door to anyone. His mother, still fragile but stronger, came to the center one afternoon and watched him help a younger boy with homework. She leaned on the doorway, tears in her eyes, whispering to herself, "He's becoming someone I always hoped he'd be." The grocery store, once the site of Daniel's shame, had changed too. The manager, under public pressure, began a small fund for families in crisis. A sign near the register now read, "If you can't afford food, ask for help, no questions asked." The ripple effect reached further. Churches, businesses, and neighbors formed a coalition to address food insecurity. School lunch programs expanded. The story of a boy stealing bread had become the seed for a local movement. One evening, Daniel sat with his mother at their small kitchen table. They were eating soup with fresh bread bought, not stolen. She smiled at him across the table. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "You said we'd get through this." Daniel looked down at his hands, then back at her. "We're not just getting through anymore," he said. "We're building something better." Outside, the city lights glowed like scattered stars. Somewhere, people were still struggling, still hungry. Daniel knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew that one act of desperation, met with one act of compassion, could change the course of a life, and maybe even a whole community. He reached across the table, taking his mother's hand. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we'll keep going." And for the first time, the future didn't feel like a dark hallway with no exit. It felt like an open door.